So, welcome to the Praxis Behind the Obscure podcast. And today I have a very special guest. I have Joe Evans on, who has been a student of the Buddha Dharma for over 2 decades. He has trained in all four major schools of Tibetan Buddhism, but has focused mostly on the teachings of the Nyingma lineage, and particularly Dzogchen. He has been fortunate enough to receive teachings and transmissions from many masters. His main teachers have been Chogyal Namkhai Norbu, Khinchen Namdrol Rinpoche, Acharya Malcolm Smith, among many others. So instead of me reading out your introduction about yourself, maybe it'd be more useful for you to kind of introduce yourself, give a little bit of background, how you got interested in Buddhism and how you kind of went along this path with all these different teachers. So yeah, thanks for coming on too.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about my background a little bit. Yeah, reading someone's bio.
Right.
Not, while you're live in a recording or a Zoom session can feel kind of awkward. So yeah. Yeah, so a little bit of that that's written in the bio. That's my sort of general history of my experience with the teachings. And I became interested in the teachings at a pretty young age. I was really fortunate. My mother, actually, when I was a small child, I was probably about 7 years old, she signed me up for a martial arts class. And I really enjoyed the way we began every class, which was actually with a brief, just silent meditation. And of course, I was a little kid growing up in the Midwest in the United States, and I didn't have this kind of experience before. So it wasn't something that I was familiar with, but I loved it, and I didn't really understand what I was doing, but it ended up actually being something that I would do in private, like in my room or on the school bus, even something like that. I'd kind of work with my mind in that way. And then later on, when I was in high school, my mother again got me a copy of the Dalai Lama's autobiography, My Land and My People. And I read it and I loved it. And I became very interested in not only His Holiness, but I wanted to know what informed his worldview and what he was doing. Like, what was his practice like? So I became very interested. And it was like probably late high school, so I wasn't very serious about much of anything, and which, I think is fairly normal. And I traveled a little bit and came back to go to school, where I went to the University of Michigan to study Tibetan language. They had a Tibetan language program there, as well as some really excellent Buddhist studies programs with Donald Lopez, who you may be familiar with, who's written some very good books, and Luis Gomez, who was a really important academic teacher of mine. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but it was quite formative to be able to be in courses with him. He was brilliant. He was an extraordinary teacher and a very kind man. So I was fortunate to spend time with him in an academic setting while I was simultaneously working at a Tibetan Buddhist temple in town in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And, of course, I had these fantasies, it's like, oh, I'm going to have to travel to India and Tibet and do all these things in order to meet a teacher. So I was very surprised to find that there was this Tibetan Buddhist Lama who was living in exile in Ann Arbor. And I met him, and he became my first teacher in a serious way. And I started working for him in the bookstore. They had this nice little bookstore in their Dharma center, and I was able to receive many teachings from him while I worked there, and also was studying in an academic setting. So that was kind of the first moment of seriousness for me. Like, I'd been reading books and things like that in between, but I'd never really met a teacher and entered into that kind of formal relationship. And I went to school, obviously continued going to school. And then eventually after school, I moved to Boston, where I then worked for Wisdom Publications.
Oh, wow.
And while I was working for Wisdom Publications, this is when I think my personal experience as a practitioner really started to develop in a concrete way. I was doing retreats and accumulations and trying to train myself as though I were in a more traditional environment by receiving teachings on different Vajrayana practices and studying Madhyamaka and other philosophical systems and so on and so forth. And during one of these retreats, I was actually doing a formal accumulation retreat for this very powerful practice that is really practiced in most lineages of Tibetan Buddhism, but the practice of Narakacho, this practice of Vajrayogini. And I was doing this practice in a closed retreat. It was 21 days, and we were doing pretty arduous sessions, like 4, 2.5 to 3 hour sessions a day. And it was a very extraordinary experience for me. And when I was getting close to coming out of it, and they had this little bookshelf in a library, and I found on the bookshelf this book by Chogyal Namkha Norbu. And that's when I really decided that when I got out of this closed retreat, that the next step for me was going to be actually seeking out the Dzogchen teachings. And that's what happened.
Okay. What book was that, by the way?
It was actually, there's this book, the title, I believe, is Dream Yoga and the Practice of Night, or maybe it's Practice of Light. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was short, and I had some time in between sessions, so I was able to read this book. And I'd kind of already known before then that this was where my path was going to guide me.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was working at the bookstore in that Dharma center, it was for a different lineage, but they had books from all different traditions. And I always kind of knew when I would see the literature around Dzogchen teachings and things like that, that was where I was going to end up eventually. But I'm a traditionalist, so I felt that it was kind of inappropriate for me to read those books without actually having some sort of connection with the teachings through a person, through a teacher. So I waited. And I did, of course I read a little bit, but nothing too serious until I got out of this retreat. And then I really focused my attention on the Dzogchen teachings.
So that actually reminds me of a question that I had, which was basically, it seems like there are two approaches to Dzogchen. There's kind of the approach which you took, which is going through, traditional, you do your Nundro accumulation, sort of like this hierarchy, right? So I'm starting at I'm getting my AA first, then my bachelor, then my master's, going through all the different yanas and have you. And then finally I make it to the mountain peak of Dzogchen. Now I can practice, 30 years later or whatever, right? And then there's other people who say, no, you jump right into the Dzogchen teachings, forget about all that, you go right to your PhD, right? So maybe you can share a little bit of perspective on maybe your experience going through what I guess you would consider, or some would consider, a traditional approach versus jumping right in. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I really I conditioned myself a little bit in the beginning because I was very zealous in my approach to the teachings. I very, very much had a lot of energy that I dedicated to practices like reciting mantras and recitations of sadhanas and things like this early on. So it was a little bit confusing for me when I started to receive Dzogchen teachings, because I came out of this retreat and immediately, I think it was within a few weeks, started receiving teachings from Chogyal Namkha Norbu. And the approach was really significantly different from what I was used to. The circumstances that I'd been practicing in were very focused on recitation of a sadhana, like a little liturgical text that you read through. And in Tibetan Buddhism, we refer to this as a sadhana, although sadhana has this greater meaning of sort of the continuity of your spiritual practice. And this is associated with yoga and things like this, which is, just something I think is interesting. So I'm throwing that in there. But anyways, I was conditioned by this kind of practice. So I was doing this all the time. And then I met Chogyal Namkha Norbu and I received some Dzogchen teachings. And in my mind, I was like, yes, this is my path. This is what I want to practice and dedicate myself to. And then I was like, but how do I do that? Because I don't have this little book to read it. He didn't prescribe anything like that. So this was a little bit challenging for me. And it took some time for me to overcome this sort of self-conditioning toward some sort of like rigid approach to liturgical practice and things like this, which, there's nothing wrong with doing those practices, but eventually we have to understand that in order for the teachings to really take hold within our continuum and really take them to heart, that we have to kind of move beyond this kind of attitude a little bit. So that was kind of the first aspect of that for me, because Norbert Rinpoche, he didn't teach the Dzogchen teachings in this kind of hierarchical sense. He didn't, when new students would come, he was never like, oh, now you go and you do these Rangdrol practices and you do 100,000 prostrations, and then you can do this practice after that, and then someday when you're finished, I'll give you Dzogchen teachings. This wasn't how he taught. He taught Dzogchen teachings directly and openly to anyone who is interested, because we have this understanding in the Dzogchen teachings when we look at them from the perspective of the primary texts, the 17 tantras that are the foundation of our tradition, that we have our own systems for Rangdrol and our own understanding of who's a qualified recipient of the Dzogchen teachings. And if we look at the primary texts and we have this kind of understanding, we know that the most important factor is sincere interest in the teachings. And since these teachings are about discovering your nature as a sentient being, then we can also understand that we already have the qualification. We just need the instructions in order to actually recognize that nature. So it's a little bit confusing sometimes, I think, for people, because we have all of these practices and these Rangdros and these other things that are traditionally taught in certain contexts. And then when someone like Chogyal Namkha Norbu comes around and starts just giving Dzogchen teachings without requiring those things, people kind of get this idea that that's unorthodox. But this is a little bit confused, because it's not unorthodox. It's actually quite orthodox and very traditional, because he's following directly the Dzogchen teachings themselves. And in the Nyingma lineage, we have this schema of these 9 yanas, or distinct vehicles, right? And they're distinguished as complete in and of themselves. So every system has its own base, its own path, and its own result. And we apply this approach to the Dzogchen teachings as well, of course. So we understand that we have our own systems for introducing students, to giving them empowerments, to helping them discover their true nature, how to stabilize that discovery, and how to actually reach the ultimate fruition, so to speak. And then it's sort of the common understanding of the approach to practice across the board for a lot of people is, I think, that you have to do a lot of different things in order to be ripened for that. And this is true for some people, but this isn't universally the case. So this is why we have teachers like, really all of my root teachers teach Dzogchen directly, because they're teaching from this perspective.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And what it was that, like, the Buddha had 84,000 dharmas that were for the different predispositions of sentient beings, right? And so maybe for some people, starting out on a different yana and then working up might be appropriate, perhaps. But if you do encounter the Dzogchen teachings, it doesn't mean one has to go through the previous yanas. One can, if it's a right fit, I guess you would say, or if you follow them, you have a good qualified teacher, get experience in them. That's a legitimate approach, obviously, as you mentioned.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it's totally legitimate. And we have this, there's also this attitude that we're not sort of throwing all of the other teachings of the other yanas out either. It's more along the lines of Dzogchen's considered to be the highest in the schema of the 9 yanas, and it's likened to standing on the summit of the tallest mountain in a mountain range. You can see all of the pathways to the summits of all the other mountains, and you understand how that functions, and you have this knowledge. So you observe yourself, and if you have a certain kind of problem or a certain kind of inclination, you apply an antidote, and you can apply any antidote from any of the 9 yanas. So we're not limiting ourselves in any way. So the main practice and the focus is the Dzogchen teachings. But we have problems. We're sentient beings in samsara. So we apply appropriate antidotes, and those antidotes typically, since we're practitioners of the Buddha Dharma, come from the other 9 yanas.
Mm-hmm. I would also say that you mentioned that you went through the whole like accumulations and reading all these sadhanas, right? So I think that, I mean, that can also, you can also condition yourself to thinking that you need that, right? Which clearly it sounds like you did and many other people do, right? It's like, I need to read out 2 hours of a playwright script and then I can enter Mahamudra or, Dzogchen or what have you, right? And so, I mean, that can be problematic in itself, if that makes sense. It creates a sort of like spiritual materialism. I need the next book to hold on to or what have you, right?
Yeah, I think it can, and it's
Yeah.
a good example of that too is Rangdrol practice, which people have kind of an idea of as, so we've got this word Rangdrol, and it means that which comes before. So that's why we get this translation of preliminary practice and things like this. And then because of this hierarchical structure of you do this and then you do the next thing, new students oftentimes end up with this idea that Rangdrol is something that you do and then you kind of get it out of the way, and then you move on to the next sort of like higher teaching, and then eventually you'll get a little bit higher and things like this. And that's not really what it means. That's kind of how Rangdrol has been maybe culturally applied within Buddhist institutions, both in Tibet and in the West and things like this. But if we really understand the meaning of Rangdrol and what you're doing when you practice Rangdrol, it's the practice that you do before entering into the state of Guru Yoga, which is synonymous with Dzogchen.
Okay.
So when we think about it that way, it's actually within the context of your practice session. So you sit down and you do purification, you have accumulations, you practice Guru Yoga. And then when you receive the empowerments, the path empowerments from the Guru in the context of Guru Yoga, and then you rest in the completion stage without characteristics, practicing Trikshut or whatever it is you're doing, that's then the main practice, so to speak. So you can practice Rangdrol as your main daily practice for your entire life. But we've placed so much emphasis on these ideas of accumulations and this hierarchical structure and approach to the teachings that sometimes this aspect of it gets a little bit lost.
Right. Definitely. All right. Well, you had mentioned that we kind of got a little bit about your earlier journey, right? But you had also mentioned that you studied with Namkhai Norbu and some other great lamas. So maybe you can share a little bit. I always like hearing stories about spending time around these sort of figures, because it's so much different when you're spending time around what you call a realized master or, high lama or whatever you want to call it, versus reading books or watching YouTube videos or something like that, right? And so maybe you can share a little bit about your time around these teachers. How did you find them? How would somebody go about also finding a qualified teacher? That's another important question too.
Yeah. So maybe some people who hear this will remember this, but there used to be, so Snow Lion Publications used to be separate from Shambhala. Shambhala kind of sort of purchased them and they became one entity, but they used to put out a newspaper, and it was very much a newspaper. It just looked like a normal, like Sunday paper that you'd get. It didn't come out every week, but it came out sporadically. I can't remember exactly how frequently, but this was kind of back then. That's how you heard about things. You looked in the paper and you'd look and you'd see who was coming to town or to an area close to you or something like that. So this is kind of how I initially linked up with Chogyal Namkhai Norbu and received teachings from him, was through this paper, and also through friends on internet forums. There was an internet forum called Sangha way back then that was very active, and Acharya Malcolm Smith was on there, and he was talking about excellent teachers that he'd received teachings from. So those influences came together in that sense. So I was influenced by this great Dharma friend and mentor and teacher of mine, Acharya Malcolm Smith, who happened to live in Massachusetts at the same time. So I actually got to meet him in person shortly after meeting him on the internet, which I think a lot of people end up meeting him on the internet. And then we became friends, and through that relationship with him, I was able to be informed about and meet several other teachers, Chogyal Namkhai Norbu included, And also really importantly for me, Jigme Rangdröl Rinpoche, he hasn't been to the United States since 2009, but he's really a very important root teacher for me. And I met him because I'd been recommended. His father was one of the gurus of Malcolm Smith, and I had heard about Jigme Rinpoche, and I went to receive teachings from him, and he was giving a very important series of teachings on Dzogchen from a text called the Yeshe Lama, which is this Dzogchen practice manual that was written by Jigme Rangdröl, who's an important lineage master for us. And he gave this extraordinary teaching on the entire Yeshe Lama, like a line-by-line commentary. And it was brilliant. And it was in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts, which is this very beautiful little small town that has this river running through it with these falls. And it was intimate. There were very few of us in the retreat. And it was extraordinary. It was formative for me in a lot of ways. And I was struck by Jigme Rinpoche's kindness. He's just an extraordinarily kind person, and quiet and really gentle, but then precise and clear in all of his teachings. So this retreat was, like a week long. It was like 7 or 8 days maybe. And he taught all day, every day. And it was incredible being able to spend this time with him. And I left that retreat and I didn't know what had happened. Like, I didn't get any of it. It wasn't like I walked out and I was like, oh, now I understand Dzogchen. I walked out and I was like, wow, I don't know what a lot of that was. But I knew in that moment, it was similar to the knowledge that I came to when I was in the other retreat, and I knew that I had to leave that retreat when it was over and find Dzogchen teachings. I left that retreat with Jigme Rinpoche knowing that this was my path and that I had to really focus on understanding this based upon that experience with him. And I told Rinpoche this. I told Rinpoche that he was my root guru and that I wanted to devote myself to his teachings and to the path that he taught. And he was very, of course, again, very kind to me and accepted me as his student in this relationship. And somewhat ironically, he hasn't come back to the United States since 2009. So for a while, I wrote him letters, actually handwritten letters back and forth that would take forever to be shipped to where he lives in Arunachal Pradesh in northeastern India. So I'd write him a letter. It'd take a very long time to get a response. And then eventually, we started using email. And it's been really extraordinary to have someone in my life that is my teacher, who I've been able to ask questions to, share significant moments in my life with, and really feel cared for by him and loved by my guru. His kindness has been extraordinary and always has been, and he's even though he lives far away, it's always been like he's a part of my life. For example, when I got married, my wife and I got married here at our home a year and a half ago almost. And, we set up an area for Rinpoche with a picture of him and some flowers and things like that, so that it was like he was at our wedding. And, and then I send the pictures to him and things like this. But it's an extraordinary relationship, and it's really an essential relationship, not just from the traditional perspective. We have from the traditional perspective is that Dzogchen teachings are based on receiving empowerment and transmission, direct introduction from a guru, from a living teacher who has that knowledge. And this is extraordinarily important. It's extraordinarily important because then you're actually receiving the knowledge of Dzogchen from someone who's in the state of the knowledge of Dzogchen. And this is the beginning. This is really the foundation of this relationship that is incredibly important. As a teacher, you're responsible for the student's liberation, to helping them understand the teachings so that they can actualize liberation for themselves.
Mm.
Because in the Dzogchen teachings, the path to liberation comes about through the intimate instructions of the guru. This is foundational to this path.
Mm-hmm.
So when you establish this relationship with someone, you communicate and you collaborate and you develop your knowledge together. And I've been fortunate to be able to do that with my teachers in a pretty direct way, with Dungse Rinpoche in particular, and being in regular contact with him, and him always responding very promptly. And the same with Chogyal Namkha Norbu when he was alive. I would send him messages and ask him questions, and he always responded and was incredibly kind to me and gave me answers and guidance all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes people end up with the idea that their experience has to be like that.
Mm-hmm.
So my experience has been, I think, a little bit unique, and I've been really fortunate to have that experience. But people also have the idea that someone's not their teacher unless they're like talking to them all the time. This also isn't true. You can go and you can receive teachings from excellent masters like Mingyur Rinpoche, for example, who's an excellent teacher of the Buddha Dharma, of Mahamudra and Dzogchen. And he gives teachings all the time, but he's quite famous. So he has many, many students. So being able to talk to him maybe isn't so easy. So someone might go and participate in one of his programs and receive some Dzogchen teachings from him, and then maybe not feel like they have a teacher still because they're not like talking to Mingyur Rinpoche and things like this. This idea isn't really true. If you receive Dzogchen teachings from someone, you have a teacher because you received that knowledge. You received the intimate instructions of the Dzogchen teachings from someone who has that knowledge and has that lineage. And you can practice confidently with that knowledge. And then maybe over time, your relationship with that person will become closer, maybe not. This isn't really the point. For me, I just happen to be really lucky that I've had that in my experience. But it doesn't mean that you need this in order to practice in a qualified way. What you need to practice in a qualified way is you need to receive Dzogchen teachings. That's the most important point. And then you collaborate with your Vajra siblings, your Dharma brothers and sisters, and so on and so forth, and you develop your knowledge gradually over time, slowly. But, there are also wonderful stories of these people. The first time I ever met Chogyal Namkha Norbu in person, for example, just for a story, I had to wait quite some time to meet him in person, in fact, because I wasn't able to go to see him when he was in person in Massachusetts right when I got out of that retreat. So I had to wait for him to come back to the United States. And when he did return, I went to a retreat, and I'd been listening to his teachings and receiving his teachings via webcast, and I'd received the Yeshe Lama from Dungse Rinpoche, so I'd been practicing. And Chogyal Namkha Norbu was incredible in this regard. He would, after every teaching, he would sit in his seat, and sometimes hundreds of people would be there in the United States, hundreds, sometimes in Europe, maybe thousands of people would be at these teachings. And people would line up to talk to him, to ask him a question, to, anything, all kinds of different things. And the first time I got in the line to meet him, I just wanted to meet him. I didn't really have a question or anything like that, but I wanted to meet this person who'd become a very important teacher of mine. So I waited in the line and I went up, and he sort of leaned over toward me and put out his hand to shake hands. And I reached out and I grabbed his hand, and he grabbed my hand, and he pulled me really close to him. And I was quite intimidated. Rinpoche was really like a striking person, especially when, you're this close.
The image I have in my mind is like, Trump does that when he like shakes other presidents' hands and he like pulls them in. I don't know if you've seen, there's like a compilation of Trump, shaking the hand of like Putin and, Shinzo Abe and stuff. He just pulls them off. Anyways, yeah. Sorry.
It wasn't quite that aggressive.
Okay.
But it was more like he drew me in, like he brought me close in this way. And Rinpoche had, his eyes were incredible. They had like this very thin ring, like I can't remember which parts of the eye it is, but it was blue, like this very light, beautiful color.
Mm,
And pulled me very close. We were face to face, and he's looking directly into my eyes. And we didn't talk.
mm.
I didn't really say anything, but he looked at me for what felt like a very long time to me. It was probably just a few seconds, though, in reality. And then he just says, "Good," of my hand. And I was like, okay. And I got up and, let the next person come up in line.
Right.
Um, yeah, he was amazing and
Mm,
incredibly kind. He would sit there and he'd have a personal interaction with everybody
mhm,
after the teachings. And another time I got to ask Rinpoche to consecrate a tanka that I'd had made. So if
mhm,
people are listening and they don't know what a tanka is, they're these traditional iconographic paintings that we use in Tibetan Buddhism, and they're not just artwork, right? They're representations of awakened body, speech, and mind. They're actually considered to be a kind of a nirmanakaya, a rupa, a physical form of awakened beings in the world that can be related to by people, by other sentient beings, people on the path, so to speak. So they're a source of the cultivation of virtue. And this is why Buddhists make offerings to statues and paintings, and they circumambulate sacred sites and buildings and things like this. So I had a tanka commissioned to be painted of Garab Dorje, who's the first human teacher of Dzogchen in this world. And I'd had this tanka commissioned with the instruction of having the facial features somewhat resemblant of Chogyam Namkha Norbu. And I went to show this tanka to him, and he thought it was very beautiful. He really liked the tanka. He thought it was really well made and really well painted. And he consecrated it for me on the spot.
mhm.
And he took it and he turned it over, and you put the syllables, the three syllables Om Ah Hom that correspond to the awakened body, speech, and mind, the three Vajras, and he wrote them on the back, as well as this symbol for the long cell teachings, which is his transmission of his own sort of revealed teachings that primarily arose for him while he was alive through his dreams and things like this. So, and we were doing this together, like again, he always, every time I got to interact with him, he always like really drew me in this way. So a good friend of mine, one of my best friends, actually was at that teaching with me and took a picture of this moment where Rinpoche and I are both very close together consecrating this tanka. And it was a really extraordinary moment for me. But yeah, I mean, you can go on with stories of experiences with your teachers, some funny, some really incredible learning experiences, like the time I got scolded by Norbert Rinpoche because I was behaving frivolously in
Right.
front of my teacher, and I got in trouble for that. And that was a very interesting learning experience for me, a very valuable one.
Mm,
But yeah, and then there are other teachers too. Like Kenshin Namdrol Rinpoche is a very important teacher to me,
mhm,
and I didn't start studying with him until a few years ago after Chogyam Namkha Norbu Rinpoche had died.
mhm,
So we don't really have a personal relationship like that.
mm,
I was kind of mentioning before, so that other people can have this understanding that you don't always need this kind of personal kind of relationship where you talk to each other and things like this,
right.
because we have an understanding in the teachings that your root guru is the person who shows you the three kindnesses,
Mm,
or according to Longchenpa in some of his teachings, there are four kindnesses.
mhm,
And these kindnesses are that you receive empowerment, reading transmissions, and upadesha instructions from them. And then if you count the fourth one, it means that you actually apply their instructions directly as your daily practice.
mm. Okay.
So for me, this would mean that I have several of these teachers that have bestowed the three kindnesses upon me. But the ones that really are the most significant are the ones mentioned in my bio,
Hmm.
Dungsen, Chogyal Namkha Norbu, Acharya Malcolm Smith, and Khenchen Namdrol Rinpoche. And the difference there is that, I don't email him or anything like that. It's not that kind of relationship. But he still bestowed these kindnesses upon me, and I apply his instructions every day, and I study his teachings every day, and things like that. So that relationship is just as profound. It's just different in the way that it functions. So if people are practicing and they're familiar with the teachings and they've received some teachings from someone, but they feel maybe a little bit personally disconnected because they don't get to talk to their teacher, you really don't need to worry about this so much. And also understand that it takes time. Like we're gradually developing our knowledge and collaborating with each other. So it's very exciting in the beginning to meet a teacher and receive teachings. And then maybe you might feel a little bit lost when that teacher goes home or goes back to Nepal or whatever, and you don't get to see them again for some time. But don't be discouraged. This is okay. You practice diligently and you develop your knowledge, and eventually things will work out for you.
Okay. How would one know if a teacher is qualified though? What would be the, signs and details of that? I mean, obviously you study with these great, well, respected masters and what have you that are well established. But how would somebody who's maybe listening to this podcast or gets inspired and they want to look for a teacher, how would they distinguish, I don't know, charlatans from a legitimate teacher that, can guide you on the right path?
Yeah. Kindness, number one, always. Your teacher should be kind, like very kind. And this doesn't just mean that, they're a nice person, which, a lot of the times they are very nice people, because those things tend to go hand in hand, but they should be genuinely kind. They should understand their responsibility, and that responsibility really means that you're responsible for caring for your students until they no longer need you. The job of a Dzogchen teacher is to make themselves obsolete. That's it. That's the only thing. So they should be kind. They should be generous with the teachings. They should be able to answer your questions if they're available to do so. And this means that they're qualified because they know the meaning of the teachings. They know what's expressed in the tantras, and they know how to convey that for students. So these are really the most important features. There are a lot of different institutional notions of what a qualified teacher is and things like that. Someone's maybe recognized as a tulku, or maybe they got a nice letter from someone, or they did a certain kind of retreat or something like that. And those are all fine. But whether or not a teacher has those kinds of institutional credentials is less important than their knowledge and their kindness.
Okay.
Are they erudite, and are they kind?
Okay.
Those are the things that we really look for in a teacher. Like, they should know the teachings, and they should practice the teachings. It can't just be some sort of intellectual understanding. They have to be a practitioner. They have to actually have their own direct experiential knowledge of the teachings so that they can help students discover that for themselves. And, the contrary of that, which is also laid out in the tantras themselves and their commentaries by Vimalamitra and Longchenpa and so on, is that if a teacher is boastful and unkind and thinks of themselves as being an important person, they're driven by accumulating offerings or accumulating a retinue and large numbers of students like that. Like, if that's someone's motivation and you're able to discern that, those are red flags. Someone who's unkind and boastful, those are your red flags, really.
What are your thoughts on? I mean, us as students, we should be generous too. We should offer dana. We should offer support to our teachers. I think, I mean, that's part of the tradition, anyways. But I noticed that when I first heard of Dzogchen, one thing that turned me off was like I saw these programs online, and it was like $900 to sign up to learn Trekchot or something like that, and I was like, hey, this sounds like that's a little odd to me. Something, kind of turned me off a bit, right? So what are your thoughts on like that kind of sort of commercialization of things. Is that appropriate, or is that considered not appropriate in this context?
Yeah, I think, well, there are, of course, varying opinions,
Yeah, yeah.
In the beginning, sort of to try to track what you just mentioned, yeah, we have this principle of dana. Dana is the way that we practice the paramita of generosity, really. Like, this is how we show generosity, and it's how we show our appreciation for the teachings. And it's incredibly important, because if students are willing to offer dana, then their teachers don't have to be distracted by day jobs and other things. They can actually teach more. So it works out quite nicely. If a teacher receives enough dana to be able to support themselves, then they can support their students by teaching all the time. They don't have to do other things, essentially. And that's kind of my opinion on how that should work.
Mm-hmm.
The more generosity a teacher receives from their students, more reciprocal they should be with the teachings. So we saw this with Chogyal Namkha Norbu, for example, is he taught all the time. He was incredibly generous. So he was just constantly traveling, constantly teaching, and things like this. So we have this kind of attitude, and we understand that this is significant, that it's important. But on the other hand, we also have this phenomena of kind of chasing after the names of teachings too, particularly in capitalist cultures like in the West, where we live in the United States. We have this idea that we are purchasing something, and then we are kind of collecting this item. We now own this thing that we purchase. And the teachings, they don't really function that way. It's not like you're not really buying something.
Sure.
In that conventional sense. You're supporting teachings so that sentient beings can be liberated from samsara, which is very significant. But of course, we have this phenomena where people are sort of marketing Dzogchen teachings and things like that, and then they're charging some money, which is understandable, of course. People have expenses, and retreats aren't free, so this is often required. But sometimes too, it's kind of like, and then the students show up and maybe not so much Dzogchen is being taught, or like very kind of surface level Dzogchen is being taught. Things aren't being explained in a precise way.
Right.
And this is a thing that happens, and I think this is, in my opinion, this is kind of inappropriate. I think that if you're going to teach Dzogchen teachings, you should teach Dzogchen teachings, and you should do it in a very serious way, because the teachings are serious. Because the subject matter is serious. It's the liberation of sentient beings. In my opinion, there's really nothing more serious than the teachings. So if the teachings aren't being taken seriously, then this is, in my opinion, negative. This is a downfall. So we have to take the teachings seriously and can't think of them as being some sort of a commodity.
Sure.
So exorbitant price ranges and fees and tuitions and things like that. These are kind of examples of, I think, the way that we're culturally conditioned to engage in the commerce of everything. And unfortunately, this gets projected onto the teachings as well.
So I can't buy Rigpa for 3 easy payments of $99.99.
Right. Unfortunately, I mean, it would probably be easier if it worked.
Right.
Like, you sign up for a membership plan.
My subscription to Rigpa.
Yeah, and then eventually you're free. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way.
Okay.
So we have to work a little bit harder than that.
All right. Okay, that's good.
But,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, in my experience, and this everything in my experience is derived from my gurus and their kindness. So my teachers, they've been available for me. They've never charged me more than I could afford to receive teachings and go on retreats and things like this. They've never rejected me in any way.
Okay.
And because this has been so important for my own path, this is the way that I aspire to treat everybody else who wants to come and learn about the teachings with me, is that I want to do my very best to be available for people
Mm-hmm.
and make sure that the teachings are available for people who are sincerely interested. Because as I mentioned before, this is really the first qualification for receiving Dzogchen teachings is sincere interest. So if you're sincerely interested, this is significant. This means that you're qualified. This means that you have a karmic connection from the past with the Dzogchen teachings. And for someone to then say, oh, you have to give me this much money or you can't receive those teachings,
Mm-hmm.
this is inappropriate. Sure, you can set a tuition, which, we do for retreats because it's expensive and
Mm-hmm.
it's time consuming and things like this. You have to like run a website and all this other stuff that
Sure.
comes along with doing anything, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So that's fine. But if it's putting some sort of unnecessary hardship on people, this is really unfortunate. Or if people are rejected because they can't afford it, like this too is really unfortunate.
Right. Okay. Before I move on to the next question, we were talking about qualified teachers. You mentioned characteristics such as kindness, practice, and knowledge. Right. Those are like the few traits. One of my teachers, actually, I started really getting into Vajrayana Buddhism around the start of the pandemic, and a lot of people study with Garchen Rinpoche. He has a big website, and what really stood out to me, I remember like the first time I found him online, it was like I remember reading, I've been studying Buddhism on and off for 15 or 20 years, but like for some reason when I saw him talk, something connected. It was like bodhicitta recognized bodhicitta or something like that, right? It was like the book I was reading. It was The Way of the Bodhisattva Avacharya, right? In Sanskrit, I think. Anyways, I was reading that and was like, oh, this is a visual representation of the book. I like got this sort of streaming bodhicitta vibe, if you want to call it, or sort of recognition, right? But you had mentioned that you had met him. You had some kind of story about meeting him briefly? One,
Yeah.
you can mention
Um,
it.
yeah, Garchen Rinpoche is one of my teachers.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, the way you describe him, I think is the way most, if not all people experience him as just exuding this kind of kindness.
Mhm.
And I was living in Boston at the time, and there was a Drikung Kagyu center close to where I worked at the Wisdom Publications offices. And Garchen Rinpoche was coming to teach, and I was excited to see him and meet him and receive some teachings from him. And I was living with my partner at the time. We were living in Boston, as I mentioned, and she was involved in a PhD program and was very stressed. She was under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress with this program. It was a particularly challenging time for her. And she wasn't, a practitioner or anything like that, but she was interested and she would sometimes attend events with me. And I thought that she might like to meet Garchen Rinpoche. So this particular center also has this beautiful, it's almost like a replica doesn't do it justice, but it's like another Jo-O statue, like the big statue of Shakyamuni Buddha that's in Lhasa in the Jokang Temple.
Mhm.
So they have one of these statues in this particular Dharma center, and she was very interested in art, so we went early, thinking that we'd go and we'd look at the statue before Garchen Rinpoche taught. And at the time, this center was in a house, a nice, relatively large house, and the Gompa area was downstairs, and they'd set up a tent in the backyard for Rinpoche to teach in. So we went in, and I was thinking we'd sneak in early in the morning and go look at the statue. And we walked in, and I was taking her to the statue, and Garchen Rinpoche is standing there, like in front of the statue. And I was like, oh, I was like, oh, you're not supposed to be here. It's like, I didn't expect to like walk in on you right here. But he turned around and he was, exuding this kindness, and he came over and shook my hand really briefly, kind of like patted me on the shoulder. And my partner was standing, sort of a little bit behind me and over to the side. And he very quickly went past me.
Mm.
So, he gave this very sort of brief, very kind, warm greeting, but then beelined it to her and like reached out and took her hand and held her hand and like rubbed her shoulder.
Mhm.
And she started crying, and she had this very profound emotional connective experience. that, was related to the kindness that you described when you mentioned Gurkhan Rinpoche. So she ended up kind of going with me to kind of see this thing that I was into and see this piece of art, and then ended up having this really powerful emotional experience with this extraordinary teacher.
Okay, that's a good
And
story.
then, I also got to meet him again in Arizona and receive more teachings from him in Arizona. And this time I took my mother, and I was very fortunate to be able to go and receive a White Tara empowerment with my mother from Garchen Rinpoche. So that was a really nice experience for both of us as well.
Oh, that's cool. That's awesome. All right. Well, we've been talking a lot about, we've been kind of skirting around the topic of Dzogchen, and a lot of listeners might not be familiar. What is Dzogchen? Where does it come from? I mean, you don't need to give like the whole history. You might be here for, 35 hours or something, but, maybe you can introduce the listeners to what is Dzogchen? Where does it come from? How does it relate to Buddhism?
Yeah. So the Dzogchen teachings, in a very simple way, are your nature as an individual, as being originally perfected and pure from the beginning, with all of the potentialities for Buddhahood. And this potentiality abides within all sentient beings. And the Dzogchen teachings are about discovering that nature and integrating into the knowledge of that discovery until those qualities naturally manifest and are no longer obscured. So there's nothing to change, there's nothing to create, there's nothing to fix, because this nature is originally perfected. It's simply obscured. And the Dzogchen teachings and the instructions from your teacher are the means by which you uncover this obscured nature and then sustain that. A very sort of brief description. This is the Dzogchen teachings. This is what the purpose of the teachings are. And this is, of course, related to Buddha Dharma, because this is the path to Buddhahood, path to complete and total awakening. So this is this particular system of the teachings. And it's a Buddhist system in that we have these very essential principles of the Buddhist teachings. We have a particular understanding of refuge. We have an understanding of naturally arisen bodhicitta and compassion for all sentient beings. And we also have this understanding of shunyata, or the empty nature of phenomena. Nothing inherently exists in and of itself. So these are kinds of like significant markers of Mahayana Buddhist practice, right? And all of these are present within the Dzogchen teachings, because of course the Dzogchen teachings are teaching of the Buddha Dharma. And historically, the Buddhist teachings originate in India and were transmitted all over the world at this point. But Dzogchen teachings originate with Garab Dorje, who's this I mentioned before, the first human teacher of the Dzogchen teachings in our world. And he had his own students who he transmitted the teachings to. And then eventually in this lineage of transmission, these teachings end up with Vimalamitra, who was an Indian Pandit, master of the Dzogchen teachings. And he traveled to Tibet with the 17 Tantras, which are, again, our primary scriptures, our primary texts for our tradition. And he transmitted these teachings to his disciples in Tibet. And that lineage transmission continues to this day. And this is really the lineage of transmission that my teachers are connected to, and the transmissions that I've received from them are connected to really the knowledge of the Dzogchen teachings that is found in the 17 Tantras of what's called the Vimaningtik, which is the essential core or the innermost essence of the teachings of Vimalamitra, which is this collection of texts that includes some of Vimalamitra's own writings, as well as these original 17 Tantras. So this is our corpus of literary teachings, so to speak. That is where we derive all of the knowledge of Dzogchen, because this is how human beings communicate, right? We communicate through words and symbols and so on and so forth in order to discover something that's beyond words and symbols and so on and so forth. So in a very brief sense,
Mhm.
this is a description of our lineage transmission
Mhm.
and the purpose of Dzogchen teachings. The
Okay.
purpose of Dzogchen teachings is freedom, so that you can be free.
Mhm.
Because your nature is primordially, originally perfected.
Okay.
And yet we're bound by habitual tendencies and obscurations.
Mhm.
And in order to discover that originally perfected nature, we apply the intimate instructions of our teachers. It's a very human oriented tradition in this regard, as all of the Buddha Dharma is. So we have this emphasis on having a teacher, and this goes back to the Buddha himself. We look at the scriptures of Mahayana Buddhism, we look at the Pali Canon, we look at all the Tantras, and none of them say something like, one time I ordered a book off Amazon and it read, and then you this isn't what we have.
Right.
We have this Nidana, and this Nidana is the beginning of the texts, and they begin with, thus I heard
Mhm.
at one time.
Mhm.
Or in the case of the Dzogchen Tantras, we also have this uncommon Nidana that has this, thus I taught at one time. So it's actually being taught from the perspective of the Buddha.
Mhm.
So this essential relationship is incredibly important. And it's not just important, like I mentioned before, from a traditional sense. It's important because we're collaborating with each other. And
Mhm.
it's the difference between, let's see if I can come up with a good example. Like you watch a cooking show,
Mhm.
right? Like you watch something, like you watch No Reservations with Anthony Bourdain,
Oh, yeah.
an episode, and he's in Morocco.
Mhm.
And you watch the episode and you learn some things about Morocco. You learn about the culture of Morocco, you learn about the food, and you have a bit of an experience. And this is great. But it's not going to Morocco.
Mhm.
This is one of the differences. And to put it another way too, it's like you listen to a Kendrick Lamar album and you don't say, I saw Kendrick Lamar today,
Mhm.
but you go see him perform in a show and
Mhm.
you're hearing the same songs,
Mhm.
but the experience is much more tangible,
Mhm.
right? You're having a more three-dimensional experience, so to speak. So
Mhm.
your knowledge that you derive of that experience is going to be much more personal.
Mhm.
These are some sort of analogies, I guess, for conveying this information, because a lot of times it's sort of like, oh, but why do I actually need that when there's all these books and these translations and things like this? And it's really about your experience as a student.
Mhm.
You have abundant resources at your disposal.
Mhm.
Why not take advantage of them in order to attain liberation? Why limit yourself, really?
Mhm.
So it's very important that we have this understanding, because it's a powerful relationship. Even if you don't, like I mentioned before, even if you don't get to spend time with your teacher and things like this relationship is incredibly important, because
Mhm.
you're relying on the inspiration of your teachers in order to be devoted to your own practice. You're inspired by receiving these teachings. You're inspired by the knowledge that they've helped you to understand and discover for yourself.
Mhm.
And this is kind of what it's all about. This is why it's an important and intimate path of practice.
Okay. It's about the direct experience rather than only some sort of knowledge or conceptual study via book. Dzogchen is primarily concerned with the direct experience of this natural clarity. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a little bit of both,
Mhm.
really. And I think it actually is a really important point that you brought up too, is that sometimes we can fall into this a bit of a trap of saying things like Dzogchen teachings are anti-intellectual or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Because we're not anti-intellectual. We're
Mhm.
anti-limitations.
Mhm.
We're not interested in limitations. And a limitation is to be anti-intellectual, because you're limiting that knowledge, right?
Mhm.
So instead, we have the understanding of that you can be a pandit. You can be a pandita. You can have this understanding. You can study a lot. You can develop a lot of knowledge. That knowledge should be useful for you. It shouldn't just be something that you're collecting in an intellectual way and not applying to the teachings. So does that distinction make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. To me, it makes sense. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so it's not one or the other, right?
Right, right, right.
So for example, if someone has the experience, like they go and they meet a teacher and they receive some Dzogchen teachings and this really clicks for them and they really truly understand and they can apply those instructions in an experiential way, they don't even have to know how to read a book.
Mm.
But this is exceedingly rare, of course. Like this doesn't happen for many people at all. The much more common approach is that you receive some teachings.
Mm.
And this is also a point that's important, is that maybe you go and you receive direct introduction from a teacher, and people have this idea that they're supposed to have some sort of mind-blowing spiritual experience in that moment.
What
And I'm
what is,
sorry.
what is direct introduction? Maybe because people who are listening might not know what that means. Direct introduction.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to finish. I'll
Okay.
do one
Yeah.
thing and then I'll do a direct
Okay.
introduction. So we have this idea of like learning and things like this. And this is also very important because when we have knowledge, we understand something, and then we're doing our practice and we have experience.
Hmm.
Without that knowledge, we won't be able to accurately identify the experience. And this is how we can actually fall into diversions from the path. We can fall into further elements of confusion and things like this. Whereas if we actually have prajna, or sherab in Tibetan, this precise, incisive knowledge of the subject,
Hmm.
and then we identify that in practice, this is really how most people develop their practice, as
Hmm.
opposed to having this sort of instantaneous experience
Hmm.
without really studying and things like this. And
That can help sort of establish one in the view, so to speak, right?
yeah, it can have that experience. But, you know, the Dzogchen view is, it's not a conceptual view at all. It's a direct experience. But in order to identify that experience correctly and know what it is,
Hmm.
you have to have the intimate instructions that give you the knowledge to actually identify that.
Mm. Yeah, I like that.
Right. So that's kind of where those things work. So, and then to go back to this idea of direct introduction, and this is sort of the way that we do, you know, this is the way that we do empowerment. Really, one of the ways we do empowerment in the Dzogchen teachings is that the teacher directly introduces the student to the knowledge of Dzogchen,
Mhm.
to the state of Dzogchen for themselves. And this can be done in many different ways. There are really kind of infinite ways that this can be done, although there are prescribed specific ritual ways of doing this.
Okay.
But what we have is a teacher who has knowledge of Dzogchen will maybe perform a ritual or something like that in a more formal way to empower and give direct introduction to the Dzogchen teachings to students.
Okay.
And it's kind of easier to explain in a certain way what this is not.
Mm.
This is not the teacher giving you something.
Mm.
So it's not like there's some Dzogchen master, some sort of teacher who has some students around and he gives direct introduction by like putting something in the mind of the student. Your Rigpa is your Rigpa. It's always been your Rigpa. It's perfect. It's beyond being damaged. It's beyond being benefited, all these things.
Mm.
Direct introduction is the teacher introducing the student to that knowledge.
Mm.
And this becomes particularly confusing, I think, for people when they think they're supposed to then have some sort of experience or like this light bulb goes on during direct introduction, which, you know, this can happen. You can have all kinds of experiences, but people get a little bit discouraged when nothing happens.
Mm.
And then they think, oh, I
Mm.
didn't get it.
Mm.
And this is not direct introduction. There's no not getting it. Like if you're in a room or like even online nowadays with a teacher and the teacher is giving direct introduction, they're in the knowledge of Dzogchen, they're doing something to introduce that knowledge to the student receives that at the same time. That's what it is. You received it. Now you go practice. And this is the thing, is that you go and you practice now that you've received this transmission of the Dzogchen teachings, this empowerment. Then you go home and you work with methods, the methods being Guru Yoga, and we have our own systems of practices that are called Rushen and Semzins and things like this that your teacher will explain to you. You go home and you work with these and you study the teachings. And then eventually your experience arises based upon your knowledge and your devotion to practicing. So we become inspired and devoted through the liberating instructions that we receive from our teacher. So we continue to practice diligently. And eventually we have an experience that we can identify precisely in a direct perception. And that is the direct introduction. That's the essence of empowerment.
Okay.
So this can happen for you years afterwards. Like you might meet a teacher and receive direct introduction from them and be like, well, I don't know what just happened. And that's totally normal. That is actually, not only is that totally normal, that is probably the case for 99.9% of people that receive Dzogchen transmission for the first time.
Par for the course, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, it is definitely par for the course. We have this idea in the Dzogchen teachings of being a Chikcharwa. Chikcharwa basically means like instantaneous realizer. And this is a person that receives direct introduction and then they're like, I've got it. In the traditional explanation of the teachings, there are two of these people.
Okay.
So if you receive Dzogchen teachings and you don't get it, you don't worry. You got it. If you were there and you did your best and you paid attention, you received this empowerment. So you can go and you practice with confidence until you actually have the experience of a direct perception of your own nature.
Okay.
And this occurs for you when you're practicing. Primarily when you practice Guru Yoga. Guru Yoga is really the main practice for us.
Okay. So in Dzogchen, yeah, you just mentioned Guru Yoga is the main practice, and you went off into other like Semzens and Rushen and things like that. Maybe you can share a little bit about what are the practices of Dzogchen. Some people might research online Guru Yoga, Trek Chod, all these other practices, right? What are the primary means to primary methods employed into getting you into Rigpa, the student or the practitioner into Rigpa?
Yeah, so you receive transmission and then you're like, oh, what do I do now? So you go home and you practice. And what you practice is primarily every day you should practice Guru Yoga as much as you can. And there are a lot of reasons for practicing Guru Yoga. And primarily what these are is we have this experience of practicing Guru Yoga means that we are reintroducing ourselves over and over again. So this is called like the path empowerment. So you went and you received an empowerment, and then you practice the empowerment as the path by reintroducing yourself over and over again. You re-receive that over and over and over again. And what this does is this accomplishes purification of obscurations, the purification of any damages to your vows and your commitments and things like this. It accumulates a great deal of virtue, and it inspires you to continue practicing the path. This is how we practice devotion in this way. And this kind of relates back to what we were talking about before with dana, like there are many ways to express generosity to your teacher. You offer financial offerings, material offerings, but the supreme offering for your teacher is that you practice the teachings you received from them. And the way that you do this is through practicing Guru Yoga. So you also are understanding when you're practicing Guru Yoga that the essence of the Guru's mind is Rigpa, originally perfected, and that this also is the nature of your mind. So you receive the empowerments again from your teacher, and then they dissolve into you, and when they dissolve into you, they come to rest at your heart center, and they sort of mingle with the nature of your mind we visualize here in this way, in the teachings. And this is how you're reintroducing and re-recognizing that which has been pointed out to you. So you're using these kinds of visualizations and maybe chanting and things like this. So you're using mind to go beyond mind, to go into the direct recognition of your own pristine consciousness in this way. So this is really the main method. And this is the thing that we do every day. And then we also have these other methods called Rushen, and Semzen. And these are more specific to sort of Dzogchen preliminary practices. So in Rushen, we have these practices where we're using physical postures, we're using our voice, we're using specific contemplations in order to exhaust the karmic tendencies associated with body, speech, and mind, in order to reveal, sort of like remove the husk around your Rigpa, your pristine consciousness, so that it can be identified in a direct perception. So really the same thing as Guru Yoga. And similarly with the Semzins, there are 21 Semzins, and it's not like you have to practice all of them. It's not sequential. You actually apply them as best works for you based upon learning how to do them from your teacher, and then you work with them and you just discover which one works best for you. And Sem is what we term as mind. So Sem is the Tibetan word for mind, and this really refers to the way that we describe the manifestation of afflicted consciousness in the teachings. And then Zin has this means sort of to hold. So you're stabilizing this, right? You're taking hold of this, of this mind, which usually leads to distraction. So you're cutting through distraction through applying these methods. And when you cut through distraction and you're no longer distracted, you're no longer caught up in mental fabrications, what remains?
Rigpa.
Or unfabricated consciousness, right? And then you can identify that. So these are sort of the precise methods that we use for coming to this recognition when we go home after receiving direct introduction and things like that.
Okay.
So this is how we actually practice the path of the great perfection, is by actually going and practicing these yogas, because this is very much a yogic practice. This is a yogic practice because we're working with what is abiding within the body of sentient beings, and we're utilizing methods to actualize the recognition of that, which is present within us. So it's an embodied practice in this way. So we're using our body, voice, and mind to come to this direct perception of our nature.
Okay. That's a good explanation. So you're using the body, speech, and mind to cut through to sort of this primordial state, so to speak. Okay.
Yeah, to sort of to cut through, or really I prefer to think of it as, and explain it as, that you're exhausting the sort of the habitual patterns of body, voice, and mind that obscure or unfabricated consciousness. Okay. So when those become exhausted, they just fall away. And then you observe, right? And this is what we refer to in the teachings as Naldubap. Naldubap basically means you just gotta let it fall. Just let it be.
Vibrations fall, yeah. So the Zimzans are working with the mind, as you just mentioned, right? Zimzans. Rushin, did you say that has to deal with the body? Because those are like body-based practices, right?
Yeah, so all of the Dzogchen teachings are really body-based in that we're working with the structure of the body in a very direct and precise way. And in all of these practices, Semzins and Rushen, to a certain extent, you're working with mind too, because you're making a determination to do a physical practice that's associated with Rushens, where you're doing like a yoga asana or something like that. You're working with your mind and you're doing a visualization and things like this.
Yeah.
But these practices, just like I mentioned before with Guru Yoga, we're using mind in a specific way in order to go beyond mind, to go into Gongpa, or the transcendent state. And this transcendent state is that which transcends fabricated consciousness, the boundaries of samsara and nirvana, and so on and so forth. So we're utilizing these methods in a precise way in order to have this experience of direct perception.
And you say using the mind through methods of perhaps visualization, or there are means that are employed, right? Like symbolic visualizations, or as you mentioned, yoga asanas and breathing practices, pranayama type practices, and what have you, right?
Yeah, so we have all of these things. We have visualization practices that we utilize. We utilize different postures, pranayama practices, chanting, things like this. So we have all of these methods in the Semzins and the Rushens, and these are really what the Dzogchen Nundro is. Like these are the preliminary practices for Nundro, or the Nundro for Dzogchen practice. So this goes back to our previous discussion too about how people have this, maybe this assumption that you have to do this tantric style Nundro with all these accumulations before you can practice the Dzogchen teachings. And if we really examine the Dzogchen teachings themselves and what they say, this is not the case.
Right.
Because we have our own systems of preliminaries.
Right.
So really what this boils down to is your teacher makes the decision about what they think is best for their students.
Right.
It's not one way or another. You know, it's not like someone's right and someone's wrong. Like
Sure.
nobody's wrong if they say, my students should do Tantric Nundro. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But there's also nothing wrong with the teacher saying, I'm going to teach my students Dzogchen directly. These are both totally legitimate and valid approaches to guiding students on the path.
Yeah, sure. Okay, what is, we went over those preliminary Dzogchen. What is Togyal and what is Trekchod in the way that you can best talk about this in a public manner? Because I realize that some of these practices are, what would you say, protected or hidden, or, you know, one needs to be initiated into them. So what can you explain what those are? Because those are terms that you see pop up a lot, but I personally don't know exactly what they are either. So
yeah. So we have these two methods or approaches to practice in the Dzogchen teachings that are sort of the main methods. So we talked about the preliminaries, Rushens, Semzins, and things like this. And then you practice Trekchod, and Trekchod is really the practice of sustaining Rigpa once you've discovered it.
Okay, so is that distinguished between Mahamudra? I know we're getting into the weeds here, but that's how Mahamudra is basically explained in the other schools, right? Is there a distinction, like maintaining Mahamudra, maintaining Trekchod? Are they different?
There are some differences. There are differences that are associated with the actual understanding of the basis as it's taught in both systems. It's a little bit different. And also the actual method of practice is a little bit different. They're very similar in certain regards, but there are some distinguishing features that are related to the way that the teachings are expressed and taught, and the Upadesha instructions for sustaining Trekchod and things like that. But in a very sort of, I think, an essential way is that you're not using mind at all at this point, or what we would normally think of as this kind of cognitive, conceptual notion of mind. You're actually just resting in unfabricated consciousness of your senses. So your senses are open. When we practice Dzogchen, we're not doing any kind of sense withdrawal like we have in some other systems and things like that, because we're actually recognizing that all of the appearances that are arising in our mind are the potentiality of your Rigpa. And this is what we have to identify. So we're actually just resting in that knowledge in a direct perception, to put it very, maybe not so simply, but to just kind of express a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish in this practice.
Resting in direct perception, resting in knowledge of direct perception.
Yeah, so we're having this experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
And then in the Togal teachings, you know, these are quite esoteric, but the basic notion is that Trekchod and Togal, they're not so distinct from each other in a way, because the essence of Togal is really based on this direct perception as well, but you're using different aspects and asanas and things like this in order to induce specific experiences that are associated with the sense organs, with the senses themselves. And these are things that, you know, are bound by Samaya and the guardians and so on and so forth. So you actually have to receive these from a teacher, and a teacher actually shows you how to do this practice in a precise way. So these are the two ways that we go about practice. And
so Togyal uses more like asanas and more. You're working with like the channels and winds a little bit more and drops, or not exactly.
well, you're doing that with Trekchut as well.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But so really, this is one of the other things with like Dzogchen being a yogic practice is that we're always working with these aspects.
Sure, sure.
We're just not working with them.
Hmm.
We're actually allowing them to
So you're talking
be
about effort versus non-effort based approach.
right. So we have this distinction between what we call the completion stage with characteristics, which is practices that apply a lot of effort. You know, these practices that are also shared with like hatha yoga, which hatha
Sure.
yoga means applying effort. Really, like this is kind of like the basis of a lot of this information or these practices. And these are what we associate with practices like Tumo and things like this, which are very useful as supplemental and ancillary practices for Dzogchen. But in Dzogchen practice, we have the same knowledge of the body. We're utilizing the same knowledge of the body. We're just utilizing that knowledge in a way that doesn't involve effort and actually allows the experience of the direct perception of that nature as it abides within you as a sentient being to arise as it is, rather than forcing anything to do anything, forcing anything to arise.
Okay.
This is what those postures, the asanas and things like that in Togal practice, for example, are oriented toward. They're very specific to that purpose.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. I heard we're getting in the weeds here a little bit, but I heard a podcast with Acharya Malcolm Smith explain that he said he felt that Togyal was the main actual practice of Dzogchen. He explained this in one of the wisdom podcasts that a lot of people think it's Trekchot is the main practice, but if you read through the tantras or something along these lines, right, Togyal is actually the main practice.
Yeah, so we have like in the 17 tantras, really like the 17 tantras by and large of the Upadesha, we have the Nyingtik tradition, which means this essential core or innermost essence or things like this. These tantras, these 17 tantras, they're really by and large explaining Togal practice in detail. And then, you know, it's a little bit difficult to apply. You can't really, it's kind of difficult to apply in your daily life.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of have to go into retreat. You have to have specific circumstances and things like that. I mean, you can do it to a certain degree, but if you're really going to advance in this practice, you should really go into retreat or something like that. So it's a little bit more difficult in that regard. And then Triksha practice is quite easy to apply in daily life once you have that knowledge. And the thing that also I think people get caught up on is that we think that they're separate from each other, and they're not separate from each other, really. Like if you're practicing Triksha in a qualified way and you maybe learn a little bit about Togal, you can apply those teachings together and they're very beneficial to one another. So for example, after I received the Yeshe Lama teachings, which include detailed teachings on Togal and things like that, once I actually understood what those teachings were, my understanding of Triksha was drastically enhanced.
Okay.
So they really function together very well. And you can't practice them independently, really. You can practice Triksha independently, but you can't practice Togal independently of Triksha. This is impossible. Okay. Like if you don't actually have the capacity to remain in a direct perception without any sort of fixation or clinging or effort, that is the unfabricated consciousness of Triksha, you can't practice Togal. Like it doesn't work that way.
Okay, cool.
So they're necessary really for each other.
Okay, makes sense.
And they function best together. And this is kind of, you know, in the very old days, like pre-Longchenpa days, this is probably how people practiced Dzogchen. They probably received Triksha and Togal teachings simultaneously right away, and then they went and applied them together. But you know, our circumstances are a little bit different these days.
Okay, I got it. Okay, cool. Well, went over a lot here, but I guess I failed to mention earlier, I actually do participate in the programs that you offer. I think I actually don't remember originally found out about your programs. I think it might have been Reddit. I use Reddit sometimes. And so there you run the Rangdrol Foundation. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Rangdrol Foundation, right? Okay.
Pretty good.
Yeah, pretty good. Oh, yeah, not bad. Not bad for a white white boy. But I think I ended up joining in. You were going over Longchenpa, 30 pieces of advice of Longchenpa, which was a really good series. And then now we're currently going over Words of My Perfect Teacher, where you give teachings on it. We're reading the book right now, and then also you have a like a clarification slash question session once a week as well, which is really good. And then so that led me to your programs, and then also you're somewhat connected with or you are connected also with the Acharya Malcolm Smith's programs, like review sessions. So that's been really beneficial for me to be able to find your programs, and then through your programs also Malcolm Smith's programs, which are excellent as well. Yeah. And so maybe for the listeners, they're listening to this, they really connect with this, they say, I want to find out more. Maybe you can explain a little bit about how you started the Rangdrol Foundation. What are the programs you offer? What are the goals? And a little bit about maybe your plans for this year as well. Like there's an upcoming Dzogchen retreat as well, I think in March, right? So
yeah. So the Rangdrol Foundation came about because I'd been requested locally to teach some Dharma here by some folks several years ago. It's been quite a while now, and I was a little bit shy, so I kept it really secret for the most part. I mean, I told my teachers, I told Dungse Rinpoche in particular, and I always, tell him about what I'm teaching and how things are going and so on and so forth. So he really guides all of this for me. But I was asked to do this, and like I said, I was kind of shy, so I kept it pretty small and local for quite some time. And it got to the point where it felt like it was necessary to allow other people to join our Sangha and participate. So I created the Rangrol Foundation with that intention, so that people could actually find these teachings and engage in our activities. And in that process,
means liberation or freedom, is that right?
Yeah, so Rangrol means self-liberation. And this is actually a principle of the Dzogchen teachings. This basically means that not only is one self-liberated through the discovery of their own Rigpa, but the only thing that can really liberate someone is their own nature anyways. So this is a completely natural process. The factor of liberation is that the nature is free from the beginning. So this is kind of the meaning and the implication of this word. And this is also my name. This is my Dharma name that I received from Dungse Rigsen Dorje, is Jigme Rangdröl. And Jigme is basically means fearless, and it's associated with these Dzogchen teachings that are connected with Jigme Lingpa and Longchenpa and Longchen Ningtik in particular, and things like this. So the foundation is associated with this name that I received from my own guru. And we have several programs. It's kind of expanding a little bit as it becomes possible for me to teach more. I have every Thursday, we've been for quite some time, we do sort of like a foundational kind of teaching, and this is open to everybody, and it's all Dana based. So anybody can come at any time, and if they are in a position to offer Dana, that's wonderful. If not, that's also okay. No one's ever turned away from anything for lack of funds for us. And we're studying the Words of My Perfect Teacher, but it's not a book group. It's really important that people don't think it's a book group. And this sometimes is kind of hard to convey, because what we're doing on the Thursday nights is we're studying foundational Dharma texts so that we can further develop our knowledge of Dzogchen through understanding the Buddha Dharma in general. This is always the point, is to develop this knowledge. So it doesn't matter if you haven't been coming, like anybody can come at any time, and hopefully it will be useful for you. And we also, every Tuesday afternoon, we do an open Q&A session for an hour where it's a free for all. You ask any question that you have. It can be about the Words of My Perfect Teacher teachings, or other teachings that you've been receiving, or something you read in a book, whatever it is, doesn't matter. And I'll always do my best to answer it directly. And we do sort of these quarterly weekend Dzogchen retreats, just sort of, 3-day like weekend retreats. And the next one's coming up in March, the 17th through the 19th, I believe, but it's on the website and the schedule, and you can also register directly on the website if you're interested. And if you're interested in the Tuesday and Thursday night teachings, you can just fill out the form on the website and you'll get the information and you'll be able to join. We'll send you the Zoom links. Everything's online. So, it doesn't matter where you live. And we're going to start doing sort of like Sunday sessions too before too long. I think the first one's going to be next month, and they'll be, 2 to 3 hours, sort of short, but another opportunity for us to get together and focus on different topics. And the first one is going to be in February, toward the end of the month, and we're going to focus on a little bit of the history and lineage transmission of the Dzogchen teachings. And then we'll probably do like one of those a month. And as long as people continue to be interested and the Sangha keeps growing, this gives me more opportunities to teach more. So if people are interested in the teachings, they're always welcome.
Okay, great. Yeah. And your long-term vision, you want to do more, I think you had mentioned like more Dzogchen retreats and kind of increase the programs as the Sangha grows, right?
Yeah, so as the Sangha grows, we'll just be able to have more teachings and more events and time to spend with each other and things like that. So that's kind of the vision at this point. And, there's some long-term visions that, we'll see if those come to fruition. But in the short term and the medium term, the principle is really to help people connect with teachings, and not only that, but to actually like help people find some kind of clarity in the teaching that they're receiving, whether those are from me or from other teachers. But it's really important that we're all collaborating and developing our knowledge together over time. So, doesn't matter if you're brand new, you've never received the teachings before, maybe you're completely overwhelmed and don't understand anything I'm talking about. That's okay, because it's not a one-off thing, like this, like I think I mentioned before, like if you're going to teach the Dzogchen teachings, this is serious. And you can't decide that you're going to teach the Dzogchen teachings and then one day say, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. That's not how it works. Like, this is a serious responsibility. So it's important that people know that this is a long-term process, even though we talk about it being, a non-gradual path and things like that. We're in samsara, and this is our circumstance as human beings. So we work together over time in order to develop our knowledge and our experience so that we can all be liberated from the suffering of samsara. And this is really the point.
Okay. Yeah, I can vouch that you're very generous with your time and explanations, and people have a lot of questions when they're, practicing and reading these materials, and you're very generous in answering those questions and trying to be as detailed as possible, which is really good to see. So if anyone's really interested in Dzogchen and these programs, I definitely recommend checking them out for sure. Definitely. So thanks for being, again, generous with your time once again. And I really enjoyed this conversation. Maybe later on we can have you on again sometime, but thanks again for joining.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. All right, hold on. Let's see again this. All right, then. Oh, hold on a second. I'm just in the recording.